Thank you so very much for coming. There's more. Here's today's humorous offering. It is my recollection and understanding that when signs like this go up, it's because they had a problem. This is the problem they're trying to fix. Seen some real humdingers around the world. Yeah, the comedian could have used that graphic last night. It would have helped. All right, the canal. How long is it? The figures are there. I'm not going to read all of this data necessarily. In fact, some of this I did tell you as we were going through on the commentary. 25 times more earth removed in digging out the canal than was removed for the Channel Tunnel going from UK over to Europe. And typically 8 to 10 hours to do a transit. That's not the full time. The full time is when they get clearance to go through. So you've got to get through the queue, go into the lock and then go through. And that time can actually be double that. But transiting from north to south is typically 8 to 10 hours. We just went in, turned around and went back out again. How many of you have done full transits? Not too many. I do recommend it. It's really very, very interesting. And actually, why not do the double one, go Miami, LA, LA, Miami, or vice versa? It'll solve your Panama Canal needs for the rest of your life. So this is the map of it. And these screens are so wonderful. You can actually read all the small print on here, unlike some of the other ships that I've done this on. So we got all the highlights up on this map. The Culebra Cut that I talked about in the history of the Panama Canal is in this area here. And of course it used to be known as the Gaillard Cut until they renamed it. Going all the way down to Panama City. And some of you went all the way down to Panama City. You saw the bridges down there. There's another bridge that's being built or will be built. And they're also going to be excavating a tunnel for the metro down in Panama City. Very different from Colón. This is a profile of it then. And we were in the Atlantic lock side, coming from the Atlantic Ocean, rising up to Lake Gatun. Of course, that's where we stopped and just turned around and went back out again. Then you would go over there. There's the old name, the Gaillard Cut. And then you would go across. If you're going through the old locks, there's two sets of locks, the Pedro Miguel lock, then there's another man-made lake over there, the Miraflores lock, then you go through the Miraflores locks, that's the old locks, we'll see some of those. On the new lock system, they built a special channel to go around that, so you don't actually go through the Miraflores lock, the Miraflores lake, when you're going through the new lock. So if we were going on a full transit, we wouldn't go that route, we'd take a little bypass. So that's a little odd because at that point when you're on the bypass, you're higher than the ships in the Miraflores lake. And so it looks a bit weird when you do that. Ships float differently depending on the water. And this graphic shows it quite nicely with warm fresh water as opposed to cold fresh water, as opposed to warm seawater and cold seawater. The cold sea water is the most buoyant, they float the highest, and then moving from that side of the slide all the way over to the other side of the slide with the warm fresh water, they float the lowest. So load on a ship is important as to how high that ship is above the water level. And that's kind of important when you're going through the locks here, because as the ship goes down into the water, it kind of gets wider. So it could in fact touch walls. So it really does depend on how much load is on a ship. You may have seen these lines on the front of ships. Do any of you recall seeing these? These are what's known as the load lines or the plimsoll lines. They were named after the individual showing up on the top there. His name, of course, was Plimsoll. Yes, very good. And he was instrumental in setting up the regulations for load limits early on, a long time ago. And we remember him today. And so what these lines mean is where the water line is going to be for the different conditions of the water, which I've listed there. TF, for example, tropical fresh water, going all the way down to WNA, winter North Atlantic. And that's where the ship is going to float when it's under load. So you can see it moves. The C1 and C2 refers to passenger ships, and whether it's under full load capacity or under less load, it too will float at different heights in different waters. Some records: the widest ship that went through the Panamax locks, those are the old locks, the ones that some of you went through, but we didn't go through it on this ship. Those are the US battleships, and I've given you the dimensions there. The largest ship that went through the lock we went through was the Triton, 51 meters at beam, the width of that, 51 meters, 168 feet. That's how wide you can be. You may have noticed there was quite a bit of room between us and one of the walls. If you were on the starboard side, that was the biggest gap as we were going through, going into the locks. And of course, those names, Panamax and Neo-Panamax, refer to the maximum size ship that will fit the lock that they're going through. Old locks, Panamax, that's the largest size. Neo-Panamax, the largest size for the new locks. And you could see the Triton there, a picture there of the Triton captain getting congratulations on being the widest ship to have gone through. These are the dimensions of the locks, and you can see that Neo-Panamax lock chambers, the ones we went through, are considerably larger. And there's a picture of a ship going through, almost touching the walls as it goes through. They changed some of the dimensions. That was updated in 2021 down to the lower right. And the draft, the maximum draft that they allow a ship to be, that is the distance from the water line to the keel, varies depending on the height of Lake Gatun. The lake is below optimum right now, and if you were observant and you were looking out, you might have seen little black spots on the surface of the water. I see some heads nodding. Those were the tops of submerged trees that were flooded when they created Lake Gatun. Normally you don't see them if the lake is at optimum level. But it was at, I believe, if I remember rightly, 81.4 feet, when it should have been somewhere between 84 and 86, and it wasn't. Again, another diagram showing you the sizes of the post-Panamax and the Panamax ships, or the Neo-Panamax, going through the locks. You get an idea of water travel down in this graphic here, the blue there, as the water is being moved from one place to another. And we'll talk more about water handling a little bit later as I get into this. Some of the largest sizes I've shown you in scale. Length, Panamax on the top, that's the largest length. The Neo-Panamax, the new Panamax next underneath that. There's a Maersk Triple E underneath, showing you the size relative to the maximum. And then there was one that couldn't go through. And there are ships that cannot go through. They are too big, like the Knock Nevis. The Knock Nevis is no longer with us. It was scrapped in 2010. But nonetheless, there are ships that are too big to go through the Panama Canal, either lock set, and they have to go a different direction, or they're just simply going to a different part of the world. The tugs were instrumental in helping us. We had 4 attending us. We had one at the front, the Alpha tug, we had 2 on the side, and we had 1 at the back, Delta, Alpha, Bravo, Charlie, Delta. The 2 at the side were keeping us close to the wall as we entered. The one at the front and the one at the back, and one at the front was not pulling us, the one at the back was not pushing us. They were there to help us keep us stable in position in the lock. You may recall that as we moved forward to the lock gate when it closed, we were tied up before the levels changed. The tugs couldn't do that. On the old locks, the mules do that. The mules are not pulling the ships, but they're holding the ships in the right position in the lock chambers. So a kind of different system. 46 in the fleet. In 2014, they were worth about 6 million each. And of course, with the engines right in the middle, they can spin on a dime. They're very flexible and very useful indeed. If you want more information about them, you can go onto the Panama Canal website. This is an example. These are all the specifications of one of those particular tugs. If you're so inclined to go and look at that detail, there it is. There's a lot of great information on the Panama Canal website. Yes, there's a Spanish section, but there's also a big English section, and it is immensely interesting. It's not necessarily the easiest site to navigate through, unfortunately, but it's all there if you persevere. I talked about the arrow signals. The arrow signals used to be used to tell the ships whether they could come and go, which side of the quay they could go onto for the old locks. We actually had arrow signals at the beginning, at the end of our locks, the Agua Clara locks. They're not used. They're there as homage to the old system, and they're not used on the old side either because it's all radio transmission. But nonetheless, that's how they used to do it. And as you can see in the picture here, they can be illuminated so things work at night. Did you see the arrows? Yes? Did you wonder what they were? No? Why not? You're not curious? Because I already told you. Right, okay. And you'd been through before, so you already knew. Yes, of course. We don't have neophytes here. These are the original locks. There are 3 sets of locks. Gatun, 3 chambers, just like the Agua Clara. Miguel, 1 chamber. Miraflores, 2 chambers. So you actually have the pictures here show you Miraflores. You can actually make it out. It says Miraflores locks. Notice the V shape on the old locks. The original lock gates going back to 1914 or even a bit before when they were installed. And of course with the pressure of the water on that V, it's helping keeping them sealed in that shape. I've given you the dimensions of them. That height that the ships are raised up to Lake Gatun, of course, it varies on the height of the lake. So it says 86 feet there, that's nominal. The lake is not that high right now. This is what Pedro Miguel looks like. All of the old locks have 2 independent lines, so you can have 2 ships going in one direction. You could, in theory, have ships going in both directions, and I have a video, I don't know if I'll show the whole thing, where indeed you do see them going in both directions at the same time. The new locks, of course, as we all saw, we've only got 1 lane going through. What's the total length? Listed up there. And again, I know some people are having difficulty in figuring this out, but yes, the water is not pumped. It is only gravity that is moving the water. So the source of that water is all Lake Gatun. That's where it all begins. And then it flows into the locks, and through culverts underneath, it will go from one chamber to the next chamber until finally, at least in the old locks, all of that water goes out into the Atlantic Ocean. In the new locks, we'll talk more about those. They have water-saving basins, so they are using actually less water, despite the fact they are 65% bigger. They're using less water, they're losing less water than the locks you see up there. Rainfall is very important. If they don't get the rain they expect in the year, well, in theory, it could shut the Panama Canal down. So it's very, very important for Panama Canal Authority to figure out how to get other water into that lake if the rainfall is going to be a problem. As I said, all original, 1914. You see here them being installed. They are hollow, just like the new gates were. As we went past those new gates, they were retracted into the walls. You could see right inside the gates, and I hope some of you did see the big cavities within there. That buoyancy helps move the gates because they tend to float somewhat. That's the amount of fresh water that is being lost with each lock cycle. That looks like a huge number. And of course, that's every time a ship goes in, that amount of water is being lost to the Atlantic Ocean. Did anyone see the master wheel? Did you go over to the Gatun side? There was a master wheel that used to operate these locks. It's on display. You saw it. Anyone else see it? Yeah, a few of you did. So there's a plan of it in place. Those were one of the 92 wheels that operated them. They were taken out of service in the 1990s. They were replaced with hydraulic struts. And believe it or not, the lock gates on the old locks are operated using 25 horsepower electric motors. Not much, right? This is what I was talking about that's on display over on the other side by the lock gates, retired in the late 1990s. 1998 was when that one was put on display. And as you can see, substantial. You don't need that. Each one of those gates is 730 tons. I already mentioned what's driving them, using a hydraulic arm. There are somewhat like 1,500 motors operating all different things through the locks. And where do they get the electricity from? Yes, it's a quiz question. Well, you all said something different at the same time. They get it from the dam, of course. That's a hydroelectric dam. That generates 6 megawatts of electricity, and that's all the electricity source for the operation of the Panama Canal. But no pumps for the water, so all gravity. This is a time lapse. About 8 minutes to fill each chamber. There's a cruise ship going through. Well, these are ships coming out because they're descending. It's getting dark. And here you have them going in both directions. Right, you get the idea. Huge culverts, of course, to move the water from one place to another. I've given you the dimensions there. You can actually get a train within. You see the worker here, giving you scale to the human. There are 14 cross culverts in each chamber with 5 openings. The cross culverts actually give them a water saving opportunity in the old locks. What they can do is they can actually move water from one corridor into the other corridor to help conserve water rather than the entire corridor going out into the ocean. So they have limited water savings on the old locks. And of course, when they do that, it does increase the time it takes for the ship to go through. So it all depends on the amount of traffic that they've got, how they do it, and it depends on the water level. So there you've got a typical cross-section of the Panama Canal lock with the train in the tunnel. Over 3 million cubic meters of concrete were poured to make those 3 sets of locks. And unlike the new locks, all of the concrete in the old locks is simply that. It's not reinforced concrete. There's no steel in there. The new locks, they do have reinforced concrete, and this was part of the problem in getting them open on time. They were supposed to be open in 2014. They were 2 years late. The 2 years was a combination of labor disputes and also some mismatch with the mix of concrete and the steel they were trying to put in. So it took a while to get it right before they could actually make the correct reinforced concrete. This is the control tower of Miraflores lock. Within there used to be a set of valves that had to be operated by hand. There were some very clever interlocks on there so that they didn't make any mistakes. You had to turn each handle in the correct sequence. This is what it looked like inside. And over on the left you see one of the old control towers, control buildings, and below that you see one of the new control towers, the one that we went past when we went through the Agua Clara locks. Of course, this is all now being computerized. So this is no longer used. Everything is done by computer, and it looks more like what you see over here. Some fancy screens and one operator doing everything that used to be done by hand on the other side by turning some of these handles that you see here all the way down, getting everything in sequence to get the ship through. We see here some of the mules. Over on the right is one of the first generation mules. That's on display at one of the visitor center. There's a second generation mule also on display at one of the visitor centers. Did anybody see any of the old mules? What are you holding your hand up for? You didn't get off the ship. Oh, last time. Oh dear. I meant this time. Right. Yeah, each one of them is over 2 million, and you can see in the picture here, they are basically holding the ship in the center. They're not pulling the ship. This is one of the third generation mules, much nicer now. They're air conditioned. And if you've been up on deck today, you would appreciate being in one of those in air conditioning. Gosh, it's hot today. There can be up to 8 of these with a ship, 4 on each side, 2 at the front, 2 at the back. It just depends on the size of the ship. And as I say, just to hold that ship in place as it's going through. There's an example. You see the mule here. There's one mule, there's another mule. And over on the other side, there's one just behind that post there. So those are the mules that are holding the ship in place in the lock. And further down on the other ship, the other container ship, you can see mules holding that too. They have duplicate gates. The duplicate gates were used because they didn't use the whole lock sometimes, because ships weren't quite as big as they used to be in the early days, so they would actually make smaller locks by using the gates in a different order. Having 2 gates was also good for redundancy. This quote here comes out of the official handbook of the Panama Canal, dated 1913, so it's really old. So when they're talking about using different size locks, they don't do that today. What they do is they group ships in a little convoy and take them into the lock and then move them through as a group. So that's not what they're for now. They're there for redundancy in case there's a problem and service needs to be done. Same thing with the new lock. There's 2 gates there just in case there's a problem with one of the gates. This is the Gatun locks, the old locks. The ship's moving through it. You can see the V shape. And of course on top, that's a bridge down there on top of that gate set. You know, you can drive across that. You can also walk across that, but not when they're open, of course. Gatun Lake used to be the largest man-made lake in the world. No longer true. The largest man-made lake is in Ghana, in Africa. And of course, as I keep saying, I can't say this enough. This is the water supply for the Panama Canal locks. The amount of water in this lake is crucial to maintaining transits through there. There's the dam. I mentioned already that it's producing 6 megawatts of electricity. A couple of figures there. In April of 2019, some records, we hit some low points. There's another lake, which I'll talk about in a minute, behind the Madden Dam, which is also a reserve, if you like, to help maintain the level of Lake Gatun. It was also lower than normal, a lot lower than normal. If they have too much water, they can get rid of it. It comes over the spillway over this dam. So there's no problem with too much water, there's a problem with too little water. Here we have water levels in Gatun Lake. It's measured daily, and all of this information is on the Panama Canal website. The yellow bar right there is January's data for the levels in Gatun Lake. So we have January, and you could see how low it is compared to all of the other years in January, and cast your eye across and you can see how the lake level has gone up and down. In the top right of this slide, there is that slope, and depending where the lake level is on that slope depends on what the freshwater surcharge is, because there will be an additional charge to go through because they're losing water. Right now it's about 2% on top. This is how much water is lost, about 205 Olympic swimming pools worth, and that's all the fresh water. Some of the salt water from the oceans is intruding into Lake Gatun and the whole Panama Canal traffic. Right now on the Atlantic side, it's well below any levels that we have to worry about. Over on the Pacific side, it did get above the EPA drinking water standard, and that was 3 parts per billion. So there is some salt coming in, but that was only during the dry season. So there's not a vast inrush of salinity into this area, which is good, but it's something they do worry about, where the salt water can come back up. We've had droughts, I've listed some of them there, and since 2020, it still continues. And because of that, then the amount that the ship can have underwater, the draft from waterline to keel will vary, and you see some of the figures there on how they've restricted it. So some of the bigger ships that could go through, depending on the level of Lake Gatun, may suddenly not be able to go through. They can float higher if they remove some containers. About 1 foot is equivalent to 400 containers. So you could take containers off, go through, and then maybe reload them. But of course, for other things carrying gas or grain or other cargo, not so easy to take something off, go through, and then put it back on. Easier for the container ships. Those treetops you should not be able to see. They should remain submerged all the time. So this is an indication of how low the water level was when that picture was taken. And indeed, we saw some of that when we were in Lake Gatun, when we passed through the Agua Clara locks. You could see the little black dots on the water surface. If you got closer, that's what it would look like, the top of the submerged trees. Remember, there was no lake here before the Americans came and built the Panama Canal. It was just land, hills and trees and whatever lived there, and that all got drowned. The Madden Dam is another dam further away. I'll show you where it is in a minute. It dams the Chagres River, the one that was instrumental in defying the French and causing them no end of trouble. Well, that was another issue too. They couldn't possibly have built a sea-level canal. Behind it is Lake Alajuela, and it can hold 1/3 of the canal's annual water requirement. It used to be known as Lake Madden, named after the person who was congressman at the time. That was built in 1935, and it helps maintain the level of Gatun Lake. So you see pictures of both the lake and the dam here. Where is it? So here's the lake, here's the locks we went through on this side. There's the Barracuda, Colorado Island, which we did see. And right over here is the lake I'm referring to. You did not see it as we went through. Nobody ever sees that. It's too far away. But nonetheless, there is this reserve with this dam that can let stuff in. This is the Barro Colorado Island. It used to be just a hill until this was flooded. It's become now a Smithsonian Research Study Institute, and they've made some groundbreaking discoveries here, both zoological and biological. You can visit this. but you need to book it directly with the Smithsonian Institute to go and do that. There's a fee to go and visit it. And in the inset picture, this is an aerial picture of what it looks like on the island. The Culebra Cut, we did not get there, but that is the man-made valley that goes through the Continental Divide. I've given you the dimensions of it. The word Culebra comes from snake, because there are supposedly 7 curves there. They've been kind of ironed out through the years as they've widened the canal. What we see when we do a full transit today is not what people saw when they went through just after the canal had been opened. And of course, it used to be known as the Gaillard Cut, named after David Gaillard, who was responsible for all the workforce running it. And unfortunately, just before it was completed, he didn't see the fruits of his labor because he died of a brain tumor. We had 2 pilots on board yesterday. That's by regulation. They are in charge of the navigational requirements for the ship, and the ship is going through the locks under its own power, but being directed by the pilot. And here's some of the pictures of pilots up on the deck. There is the Culebra Cut. As you can see, it looks pretty straight now. The Pan American Highway's down here, so this is the Pacific side. That's the cut. Titan is up there. That's a large crane, but we didn't get to see Titan. Dredging, very important. They have to keep the canal clear. Material is always falling in. The land here is not stable, and through the years they've managed to keep the angle of repose lower and lower and lower. The angle of repose is that angle at which the earth stops falling into wherever the hole is. But they have not yet got the angle of repose flat enough all over, so material still comes in. They still have to keep dredging. Very important part of their operating costs. In 2013, they spent 33 million widening it with the new locks, and it's an ongoing maintenance activity. In the annual reports, unfortunately, they're not breaking out exactly how much dredging costs, but their operating costs in 2023 was almost $2 billion. Part of that will be dredging. Don't you feel sorry for them? It's so expensive to do. You probably want to know what their income was in 2023 too, right? Well, about $1 billion more. These are the number of employees. So when I did this in 2018, there was just under 10,000. Since then, it dropped to just under 9,000 in 2022. I don't have access to last year's data yet. They haven't published their annual report. But you can see how it's split out. And Gamboa's in the middle of the canal. The Atlantic side is the red, and the Pacific side is the blue. So most of the workforce seems to be out on the Pacific. Well, there are individual locks there, Pedro Miguel, Miraflores, and you've got the Cocoli locks out there too. This is how they're distributed across the isthmus. Most of them down on the Pacific side, but also a good portion up in Colon. This is where they come from. This is their home within the isthmus. There's the Miraflores Lake. And so that's only raising or lowering them by 31 feet because it's just a single lock chamber. Remember, it then has to go down to Miraflores to complete the transit. This is the Miraflores Lake, and a small man-made lake, giving you the dimensions there, links Pedro Miguel to Miraflores. This is Miraflores. It's the two-chambered lock, which raises or lowers them to the Pacific. And of course, they've got a big breakwater out there. Remember, on the Pacific side, the tide height can be as much as 20 feet high from high to low. Not so on the Atlantic, it's just a couple of feet. Hollow gates, of course, and mitered, as you see, for extra stability. That's Miraflores. This is the tide information. Again, you can get this from the Panama Canal website, so it gives you the times and heights of tides. All this is very important information for operating the canal. And this graphic shows you how the tide height varies. This was done in October of 2019, but it really doesn't change. The dates change, but the shape looks the same, so you get the idea of what it's like. If you had gone through, you would have seen Titan, Hermann the German. He was a World War II war spoil. There were 4 of them, actually, that were captured in the war. One was captured by United Kingdom, and it sank when they transferred it. One was captured by the Soviet Union, and we have no idea what happened to it. And one was blown up. So this is the only one that we really know of in existence, and it was in operation up to 1994. Ajax and Hercules were the cranes before it. Ajax was sold off 1955, but we still see Hercules around, and that's in the reserve fleet. And of course, these cranes are instrumental in moving heavy things from one place to another. This one can lift 250 tons to a height of 6 meters. They used to be the world's biggest floating cranes, but Titan has now got that record. They've had a few accidents in here. This is a sinking that took place in 1970, and it was the floating cranes that managed to pull it up and move it out. This was an important sinking because the cargo in here was rice, bale cotton, and 200 barrels of heavy oil. Now, why is heavy oil such a concern in the waterways here? Well, not only is the fresh water needed to supply the locks, but the fresh water in all of this system supplies the drinking water for people living in these areas. So you don't want the heavy oil in there, so they had to try and get it out as quickly as possible. There was another one near the Miraflores lock in 1999. This sank, caught on fire. It was picked up, moved out, and scuttled in deep water in 2002. And you see some pictures of it here. There's the bridge down on the Pacific side. Oh dear, done it again. Don't you love these technical errors? We're back. Not quite back. Now we're back. The new locks, these are the Crowley locks, identical to the Agua Clara locks that we went through. If you remember, I said Agua Clara stands for fresh water, remembering that they lose fresh water all the time. Here are the lock gates coming. They're absolutely enormous, as you can see by comparing. Where's the crane? Where's the crane? There's the crane. See the crane there? And look at the size of the lock next to it. Absolutely enormous. And the size of the people as they were installing them. Moving them in with heavy equipment, taking them down, squeezing them into those narrow valleys to put them in where they're retracted, only just fit. Well, of course, they planned it well. These are the dimensions of one of them. There's 16 of them. They're all basically the same size, so you get an idea for exactly how big they are. They do vary somewhat, but nonetheless, each one of them is 2,300 tons, thereabouts. Absolutely enormous. Remember the old lock gates, 730 tons? These are much larger. These are pictures I actually took as we were going through yesterday. You can see the hole there in the lock gate. Because of that hollowness, their effective weight when they're surrounded by water is 10% of their dead weight. So that's from the buoyancy. It's only 10% of the dead weight because they made them hollow and they're floating up. Those posts standing there are locations of the water controlling valves, and you saw those posts sticking up all over the place as we were going through the locks. If you wondered what they were, they are the control posts for the valves that open the water so it can go in and out. The gate rolls, it's done with electric motors, so basically there's a cable on there, or there's a little push cart there that pushes it, so it's pulled one way, pushed another way, and it rolls out, and you saw that in operation as we went through. That's where the pulling and pushing is done. That's a control motor. How much concrete did they use? About as much as 2,000 Olympic swimming pools or 2.2 Great Pyramids on the Giza Plateau. That's how much concrete was used in building the locks that we went through. And the picture there, 2015, they are building it. How much steel in there for the reinforced concrete? As much as 19 Eiffel Towers, or 192,000 tons of steel is in those locks. You see here the culverts on the side where the water is going through, and it's big enough for 2 rail cars to go through. 8.3 meters wide, 6.5 meters tall. So 2 railroads can be put in the culvert to move that water in these locks. Well, you need to move it as quickly as possible. These people are standing inside the water handling system. You don't stand there anymore because it's flooded, but they're in there. So you can see how large it is. The water saving basins, as you can see in this graphic, are at different heights. If you imagine the amount of water going into the lock as 5 slices, then the top 2 slices are coming from the lake. The next 3 slices are coming from the water savings basins, and this is how they are moving the water around. They're using 60% of the water. They're able to reuse it. Otherwise, they'd be losing an enormous amount of water every time they went through. They are using 7% less water than the old locks are, even though they are 65% bigger through the water saving basins. This is another graphic showing you how the water moves from one place to the other. And because these locks are so much bigger, they can carry about 2.5 times the amount of cargo. And I've just given you those numbers on the amount of savings on the previous one. All by gravity. So that's why the water saving basins are at different levels, as water flows downhill. Clever design. This shows you another one, the schematic of the water movement. It's basically what I just said. Depending which way you're going, whether you're ascending or descending, I just gave you the passageway for the ascending, the first 2 slices coming from the lake, and then the other 3 slices coming from the water savings basin. When it's the other way round, then it's from the water savings basin, the top 3 slices, and then you lose the bottom 2 slices off to the sea. Difference in the lock sizes. Neo-Panamax used to be a little bit smaller. It's now bigger than 15,000 TEUs. What's a TEU? A 20-foot equivalent unit. It's essentially the size of a container. This is the record. This ship that went through here, which was the largest ship, the Triton, had just over 15,000 TEUs on it. There was another one that had over 16,000 TEUs on it, but it was a smaller ship than the Triton. So while it had more containers, it was a smaller ship. And in fact, some of these ships can go up to 21,000 TEUs on board, but they can't go through the canal. You will recall that tugs were helping us. There's a tug at the front of this ship. There's a tug at the back of this ship there. So there's always space at the front and the back of the ships going through the new locks for the tugs. No tugs on the side. They're only used when the ship's coming in to push it up against the breakwater. No mules, tugs, as I said. Don't pull it, they just help. That's what it looks like as we were approaching. There's the Agua Clara locks. We would have seen that. I'm sure some of you did indeed. And here's a time lapse going through. We, of course, did not do it that quickly. Those are the Cocoli locks, the same as the Agua Clara locks. The water-saving basins you see there, which help, and the 3 chambers taking you out into the Pacific on the back of that photograph. Number of bridges, 5 right now. Another one proposed. There's going to be a new bridge planned for Panama City, in addition to the tunnel I mentioned earlier for the metro. The most recent one that was opened was the Atlantic Bridge, which we went under. We were here actually when they were building it. We could see the pylons going up. And so it was finally opened in 2019. And there are some service bridges across there. This is the new one, a representation of the new one in Panama City. They have not yet started to build it yet. Don't know when it's going to be completed. There's the Atlantic Bridge on the top left. It's a 4-lane highway, a couple of service bridges, and the old railroad bridge that isn't used anymore at Miraflores. How much does it cost to go through the Panama Canal? It used to be very complicated. This is the old toll structure. They don't use this anymore. They've got a new system in place. The new toll structure of last year reduces the 430 tariffs down to about 60. So they simplified it. I've been on the Canal website and it's totally confusing. I hope I would never have to do it. They also had a loyalty program too, but they kind of discontinue it, but they're going to keep it there for a couple more years. You see the costs there. That's per weight. And there's other tariffs on top. Don't ask how much this ship costs to go through, nobody will tell you. The least amount of money to go through was this individual here, Richard Halliburton. He paid 36 cents to go through the old locks in 1928. That charge was based on his weight. He swam through. I'm not sure if they'd allow you to do it anymore, but he did. He was a travel writer. He was well known at the time. His grave over there at the left is empty because unfortunately later on he tried to sail across the Pacific Ocean in a Chinese junk called Sea Dragon. Well, it didn't live up to its name. He ran into a typhoon and we don't know anything more about his fate, excepting he never came back. He's also known for Hangover House, which was at one point claimed to be the most modern house in America. It's in Laguna Beach. The highest toll that I'm aware of is the Norwegian Pearl in 2010. It cost just over $375,000 to go through, a little over 2,300 passengers and a little over 1,000 crew. That gives you an idea of the costs involved in going through the Panama Canal. This is the revenue. 2022, 2023 is not out. Up the top here, we have Balboa bills. They are no longer in circulation. They're withdrawn. They use the US currency. They do have their own coins. And one Balboa in memory of Vasco de Nunez Balboa, who was the first to see the Pacific, is equivalent to the US dollar. So you can see there in billions of Balboa. In 2022, their tolls were just over 3 billion Balboa, and the amount of tonnage that went through in 2022 was a little over, just under 520 million tons of material. So they're making lots of money. The millionth ship to go through in 2010 is shown here. There was a ceremony for it. The SS Fortune plum. It went through the old locks. It was a dry bulk carrier. There was a little ceremony for the people that went through. That was the millionth ship that went through. Passenger ships, there's some figures here. Don't have the most recent data yet. Largest passenger ship still is the Norwegian Bliss that can go through. And as you can see, their income is a little over 3 billion. If any of you went through Cologne, you're probably wondering where that 3 billion goes, because it doesn't go there. Such a shame. I hope nobody went in. Some figures. This is the transit times, and it varies, of course. The grand average is 26 hours. Near Panamax average is 23.5 hours. That is from when they get clearance to go through. The actual transit time through the locks, the average was 10.87 hours, and for near Panamax, the average was 14 hours from one side to the other. So the full transit takes longer because they have to get organized and they have to come in and go through. All of this information is on the Panama Canal. You can get things like this too, advisories to shipping, and down the bottom they give you the specific examples. They give you the number of arrivals, the number of ongoing transits, the canal water time. That's the amount of time to go from one side to the other. I just showed you the grand average for that. And then the in-transit time in hours is also listed. For a few years, couple of years, they did a passenger or a client survey, client satisfaction survey. And unfortunately, the response was only about 24%, and the review response was only about 15%. So now in the annual reports, there's no indication of satisfaction surveys. I guess they gave up, and they didn't get that much good. About 63% as a favorability index. So a lot of unfavorable replies came back too, so they're not doing it. I have to talk about this. This was supposed to begin in 2014. It was supposed to be finished by 2020. This is the Nicaragua canal that was going to be built by the Chinese billionaire. It would have cost somewhere between $50 to $100 billion to do. This is the routes that were being proposed. The Chinese stock market crashed, ruined him. So nothing ever happened, but there is still a possibility maybe one day that there'll be another route established through the isthmus. This is him. This is the Chinese billionaire Wang Jing, and this is the Telegraph. 24 billion was the original estimate, but it got inflated. It was also touted by an analysis agency as an unrealistic proposal. So it didn't happen, unfortunately. And that brings me to the operation of the Panama Canal. And so now you've seen it, you've heard it, you've read the book, you've seen the film. Thank you so much.